Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and good day. And this is the first time I think it's ever been used literally because you could be listening at any time um, during this quarantine period. The way that this is going to work is that I'm presenting the presentations that I normally would during regular class time, except it's all being recorded. Your job is to listen to the recordings, and then take notes just as you normally would. You can use your own paper or the template for the note taking that you can find on the Rosenworld website. Now, I'm doing this at an ad hoc basis. I'm not doing this professionally, and it's my very first time trying the software and doing it as I'm doing it. I probably will get better as time goes by. I hope I don't miss any pages or am obscure, but I will do the best that I can. So let us then begin with the first look for the Chapter 4 material, Interdependence and the Gains from Trade. We are beginning with the first part today, which is markets and completion. Yeah, and that should be competition, I think. And then we'll also be looking at supply as well. So let us just begin. The textbook begins with a question on what is a market, and we had covered markets earlier before, and normally I would ask you if you had any thoughts, but you can do this quietly by yourself. Let me then continue by giving you the full dictionary definition, and you can see it right in front of you. Market is an actual or nominal place where forces of demand and supply operate, and where buyers and sellers interact directly or through intermediaries to trade goods, services, or contracts or instruments for money or barter. Markets include mechanisms or means for one, determining the price of the traded items, second, communicating the price information, third, facilitating deals and transitions, and fourth, affecting distribution. The market for a particular item is made up of existing and potential customers who need it and have the ability and willingness to pay for it. Now that's pretty long. A more simplified example of definition is a group of buyers and sellers of a particular good or service. So let's just explore some different markets that are out there. The first is financial markets, and these are large-scale platforms of financial exchange like stocks, bonds, derivative commodities, money markets, things that you haven't learned about yet. The photograph in front of you shows the New York Stock Exchange, which is a market for stocks. Today it's going down, so don't go there. There are stock markets all over the world. You can find them in places like London, Tokyo, South Africa, and so forth. Another type of market is the reinsurance market, and these are markets for insurance companies to themselves buy insurance, and this is a way to transfer risk. So if you have a life insurance for 1 million people, and suddenly there's a virus that goes around and kills them, you might want to have insurance for that. I think it's too late now. I am drinking coffee, so live with it. Another one is something that you are familiar with nowadays, and it's come about in the last 10 years, and that's crowdfunding. And that allows people to pitch projects, ventures, to ask for money for life crises like funerals or lack of mortgage payments. And it's calling for the community to to raise the funds. And the last of the examples I'll give you is something that most of you are familiar with, that of the farmers market. Here in Cerritos, we have this, and these are physical locations used to sell agricultural products directly to consumers. Now, this is just the tip of a very, very large iceberg, so don't think this is all that there is, of course. Now, with markets comes the concept of competition, and that brings to the question, what is a competitive market? So give that one a few seconds of thought. You can even pause the video if you'd like. So let me define it. A competitive market is a market in which there are so many buyers and so many sellers that each has a negligible impact on the market price. That is to say, each buyer knows that there are several sellers from which to choose. Sellers know that each buyer purchases only a small amount of the total amount sold. And for the purpose of this lesson, we're going to assume that markets are perfectly competitive. Now, if we're looking at a competitive market and want to look at its characteristics, it includes the goods being offered for sale are exactly the same. The buyers and the sellers are so numerous that no single buyer or seller has any influence over the market price. Now, because buyers and sellers must accept the price as given, they're often called price takers. Now, in the real world, not all goods are sold in a perfectly competitive market. A market in which only one seller is called a monopoly marker. And there's the monopoly man right there to remind you of it. But some markets fall between perfect competition and a monopoly. So we'll start by studying perfect competition, the situation prevailing in a market in which buyers and sellers are so numerous and well informed that all elements of monopoly are absent, and the market price of a commodity is beyond the control of individual buyers and sellers. And that's that for that section. Boom. We'll move on to a longer section on demand. Let's get started. And there's another definition, the demand curve. And as you can see, the amount of a good that buyers are willing and able to purchase. Now, what do you think is the most major determinant of quantity demanded for a good, whether it be shoes or automobiles, houses, or pencils? Usually it's some kid in the back who gets this answer. And you know the answer. No, you don't. I guess not. The price of things, of course. Now, since economists see themselves as scientists, they put all of this into some simple mathematical formulas. Behold, the demand schedule. Okay, let's not use this demand schedule here. Instead, we'll use one from, you can find it on page 66. You can see that the demand schedule is a table that shows the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded. And naturally, all this information can easily put on a graph. So we can see here, for example, if the price of the ice cream cone was zero, people would demand 12 cones. If it was $1.50, they would have 6 people demanding it. And if it goes to $3, that would be considered way too much, and no one would want to buy it. So we can put this all in a graph called, wait for it, the demand curve. So let's use your textbook example. Here is the demand scheduled for the ice cream cones that I showed you just a few moments ago. With the price drawn on the vertical axis and quantity demanded represented on the horizontal axis, you can see how we can easily plug in the different values in the graph. A line is drawn to connect the data, easy peasy. You can easily see the relationship between the price of the cone and the quantity of ice cream cones demanded, even for data that is not represented in the original demand schedule. In this case, a decrease in prices results in an increase in the quantity of cones demanded. All of this is drawn on the demand curve, which often really is curved, but is often a straight line. Try it yourself. Here is a demand schedule for pencils. Write up a demand curve in your notes based on this data, and it should take no time at all. Just pause the video and do what you can and come back. Welcome back. Well, hopefully with all of that clear, we can move on to get a few new terms and concepts. In this case, market demand versus individual demand. This boils down to what everyone in a specific market demands. For example, Fred and Frederick calculate how many popcorn chickens and how much boba to buy in order to sell after school. They are anticipating market demand. How many people do you believe are willing to buy popcorn chicken and boba? And besides popcorn chicken and boba, there are more. Automobiles, pencils, tutoring, books, opera, houses, illegal drugs, and about a million other things. Our next concept is called the market demand. And you've already come across it. The demand curve is a graphic representation of the relationship between the price of a good or service and the quantity demanded for a given period of time. In a typical representation, the price will appear on the left vertical axis, the quantity demanded on the horizontal axis. Let's take a look at how this is explained in your textbook. It's pretty easy to figure out. The quantity demanded in a market is the sum of the quantities demanded by all the buyers at each price. Thus, the market demand curve is found by adding horizontally and individual demand curves. At a price of $2, Catherine demands 4 ice cream cones and Nick demands 3 ice cream cones. The quantity demanded in the market at this price is 7 cones. The information can easily be represented in a graph. Here is Catherine's demand for ice cream, and here is Nicholas's demand, and here is their sum. As you can see, demand curves are summed horizontally, meaning that the quantities demanded are added up for each level of price. You can see that the market demand curve shows how the quantity demanded of a good varies with the price of the good, holding constant all other factors that affect how much consumers want to buy. The red line has shifted. Thus, shifting of the demand curve then leads us to our next major concept on. By shifting, that is to say, moving the demand curve to the left or to the right, we can show any change that increases the quantity demanded at every price and any changes that decreases the quantity demanded at every price. The demand curve juts to the left or to the right. So check it out. Let's say it's 100 degrees in the shade. You're hot as blazes, and so is everybody else. There is an increase in the demand for ice cream cones, right? So the demand curve moves to the right. Now, it's 48 degrees out. It's rainy. You and everyone else is chilled to the bone. There is a decrease in the demand for the ice cream cones, and the demand curve moves to the left. Based on what has been shared, you've probably figured out that demand can change or shift due to all sorts of different variables. For example, it could be income, the price of related goods, tastes, expectations, or the number of buyers. So let's take a look at each of these things individually. We'll start with income. How much income people earn can change the dynamics of demand. When there's an increase in income, such as a raise, it leads to an increase in demand, all things being consistent. It works the other way around as well. A decrease in income leads to a decrease of demand. Common sense, right? But economists don't just like letting things alone, as they have been able to identify different sorts of goods associated with income. Normal goods and inferior goods. So let's check these guys out. A good that you buy less of when you have less income is called a normal good. Your textbook gives you examples of things like ice cream, but just about anything else can be a normal good. Baseball cards, shoes, books. You have an increase in income, it leads to an increase in demand, easily observable. This moves us to our next concept for demand, the inferior good. Now, don't get confused by the term inferior with bad, like a broken down car, or instead of a new one, or rotten tomatoes. An inferior good is something, again, all things being equal, that an increased income results in a decrease in demand. For example, you get a raise, you're not going to be buying Walmart jeans. You get a raise. Pirate CDs are not going to go. You get a raise, you're going to have a car, you're not going to be taking the cow. And many of you next year, of course, will be enjoying college. And when food services close, you're all going to have a bowl of tepid water and, of course, ramen. But when you get that raise, when you get that great job, you are no longer going to be eating ramen, at least cheap ramen. So, yes. Income. Another reason for change in demand is the price of related goods, which is two goods for which an increase in the price of one good leads to an increase in the demand for the other. Related goods come in two flavors. The first is called substitutes. The second, complements. Let's start with the substitute. For you, a Coca-Cola might be okay. But if you can't get it, you might be all right if you substitute it with a Pepsi. However, something like an off-brand cola, taste-wise, status-wise, whatever, may not work for you, but it is still a substitute for Coke. Can you think of any others? Let's take a look at the next idea, the idea of complements. Complements are defined as two goods for which an increase in the price of one good leads to a decrease in the demand for the other. For example, if there is an increase in the price of, automobiles, there will probably be less demand for them. And if there is less demand for cars, what is absolutely guaranteed that there will be less of a demand of as well? Well, of course, It's gonna be gasoline. Now, can you think of any other examples? I'll wait as I take a sip of coffee. Oh, yum. Taste is another determinant of demand. By taste, we mean simply what we like or dislike, prefer or defer. The little girl here definitely doesn't like broccoli. She probably doesn't demand it for dinner or lunch or any other time. She might instead demand, pie or Oreo cookies. Who knows? Maybe she likes giant slugs. Well, she'll just have to deal with the broccoli. Another one of these is called expectations, or expectations about the future. And this is pretty easy to figure out. If I am expecting an increase in my income, let's say by a few $100s a month, I might decide I can afford to get that brand new tux I had my eye on. Conversely, if I expect higher prices on an item, for example, on, let's say, bow ties, well, I would buy as many of them as I can now. Get it cheap while the price goes up. We can see this going on right now with toilet paper. People anticipating the amount of the price to go up and so forth, and so they're buying as much as possible. Finally, the number of buyers also creates demand, and that's self-evident. For example, let's say more people who come from India move to the United States. I guarantee you that the demand for samosas will go up. Okay, I know that's not a samosa, but look at them. They're delicious, and you would say, some more, some more. All right. They could demand Samoans. No. All right. Samosas. This joke works better in a live class than over the video. To end the section, you do have page 69 to 71, which has a full discussion of demand related to smoking. I'm not going to go through this, but you do need to read it on your own, and it illustrates clearly what happens to the demand curve when warning labels are put on each pack. And you are expected, of course, to continue the outlining that you had begun. Put today's date, which would be Friday the 20th of March 2020, on it. Let's get underway. This will be shorter than yesterday's. So let's begin by getting some definitions out. Quantity supplied has two parts to it. First, it's the amount of a good that you have. For example, Fred can supply 12 bobas, and Frederick can supply 21 popcorn chicken pieces. Pretty self-evident. Quantity supplied can also be looked at a different way. What sellers are willing and able to sell. Just because I have 100 perfectly preserved copies of, Action Number 1, doesn't mean I'm willing to sell them. Why not, by the way? There is the law of supply, which states simply, all things being equal, when the price of a good rises, the quantity supplied of the good also rises. When the price falls, the quantity supply falls as well. Let's illustrate this point by proving it to you with a supply schedule. That is to say, a table that shows the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied. Let's return to our old friend, the ice cream cone. And this is the supply schedule for the price of ice cream and the quantity of cones supplied. We can see here, no cones at $0, 3 cones, 5 cones would be $3, and so forth. Let's take a look at this data illustrated on what is called a boom. We start with the familiar price line and the quantity line in the graph. We plug in the prices of ice cream to the quantity of cones supplied. Here we go. We connect the dots to give us our supply curve, and we can easily see that an increase of price increases the quantity of the ice cream cones supplied. So it's not going to surprise any of you at all that the market supply can be expressed as the sum of the individual supplies. The quantity supplied in the market is the sum of the quantity supplied by all of the sellers at each price. Thus, the market supply curve is found by adding horizontally and individual supply curves. At a price of $2, Ben supplies 3 ice cream cones and Jerry supplies 4 ice cream cones. The quantity supplied in the market at this price is 7 cones. And you can easily see that. And no surprise, just as with the market demand is expressed by market supply, the sum of the individual supplies, like Ben's supply on the table shown in the last slide, Jerry's supply, and well, you put them together and it becomes the market supply. Just as in demand, if there is an increase in supply, the supply curve shifts to the right. If there is a decrease in supply, the supply curve shifts to the left. As with demand, if you have several, let me start that one again. Just as with demand, you have several variables that can shift the supply curve. For example, you can have input prices, technology, expectations about the future, and the number of sellers. So let's take a look at all of these separately. A finished good or service, such as a computer, is called the output. The stuff that is needed to finish that good or service is called the input. Our computer here is made up of many components to build, such as raw materials like chips and aluminum. There is the labor needed to put together and finish a computer. To sell the computer, there might be things like licensing fees and tons of other things. All these inputs are also known as factors of production. So, if the price of inputs goes up, the cost of producing the goods increases. Supply is negatively related to prices of input. Higher input prices and the demand decreases. Technology is next. And yes, that handsome gentleman is me back in 1985 or so. And if there's, again, technology was next. And if there's an advance in technology, it reduces the cost of the firm. Now, ignore my picture there and look over to my right, your left. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a Commodore 64 computer. It had, wait for it, 64K of memory. Together with the monitor plus a disk drive, it set me back about $900 when I bought it back in 1985. That is the equivalent of about $2,146 in 2020. you can buy a Commodore 64 today at eBay with all the trimmings for about $100 and then pray that it works. But why would you want that when you could, for example, get this? This is the equivalent computer that you can buy today with all the bells and whistles. And to be honest, you can get a perfectly working system for $500 or so, which would be a lot less than what I paid back in the old days. That was the 1980s. That was back in the upside down, of course. Next is expectations about the future. What this means is that you expect higher prices for a good that you have. You might decrease your current supply in order to take advantage of it. For example, let us just say that you happen to own 10 autographed copies of LeBron James's sports shoes that he used in the past 5 years with the Lakers. You are offering them on eBay at $1,000 each. Then you discover, a week before it's announced, that LeBron James will be retiring from sports. You realize that your shoes are going to be worth a lot more money now because there will no longer be any used LeBron James shoes available. So you withdraw all but one of your shoes, which you price at $1,000, hoping that its greater rarity will earn you more in the end. There is a decrease in the current supply because of a rise in the number of sellers will increase the supply. For example, if you are the only one selling Jelly Babies in Southern California, every British expatriate and Doctor Who fan is going to pay top dollar for it. But if a whole gaggle of these people, remember them, come to sell, there is going to be an increase in supply as everyone will want to get in on the act. To summarize then, the variables, again, the price of the good itself, representing the movement through the supply curve, shifts depending upon input prices, technology, expectations, and the number of sellers. We'll be looking at supply and demand together in order to bring us to the end of the chapter. And hopefully you are taking notes. Chances are you might even be watching this a couple of times and so forth. And if you have, good for you. So let's get going. Most of you remember our good friend, the ice cream cone. And she's back for you all. And let's once again graph the demand and supply for ice cream cones. Again, you start with the demand curve. That looks familiar. And then to the supply curve. Here's supply and there's demand. This should now be very familiar to you. Now, see where the supply and the demand intersect. That intersection point, the red dot there, is the equilibrium. It's a point where both of these lines intersect. The equilibrium price and the point where it coincides with the quality is called, wait for it, the equilibrium quantity. So these are terms that you will need to know, and you will be, pretty well understanding it. So let's get some definitions out of the way. So, equilibrium is a situation in which the market price has reached a level where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. It's where the supply and demand curves intersect. Get it? Equilibrium price, as you can see up here, is the market price where the quantity of goods supplied is equal to the quantity of goods demanded. This is the point at which the demand and supply curves in the market intersect. It's the market clearing price. The equilibrium quantity is the quantity that exists when a market is in equilibrium. It is simultaneously equal to both the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. In a market graph, the equilibrium quantity is found at the intersection of the demand curve and the supply curve. A good working definition of a surplus is, quote, a situation in which quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. So how do you eliminate surplus using the laws of supply and demand? You lower the price until the market reaches equilibrium. If the actual price is lower than the equilibrium price, there will be a shortage of the good. That is to say, shortage is quantity demanded, is greater than quantity supplied. So, what is the response to create equilibrium? You raise the price of the good. We can see this much more easily by using the graphs. In the panel here, there is a surplus because the market price of $2.50 is above the equilibrium price, the quantity supplied, 10 cones. It exceeds the quantity demanded, 4 cones. Suppliers try to increase sales by cutting the price of a cone and moves the price towards its equilibrium level. In the second panel, or the B panel, there's a shortage because the market price of $1.50 is below the equilibrium price. The quantity demanded, 10 cones, exceeds the quantity supplied, 4 cones. With too many buyers chasing too few goods, suppliers can take advantage of the shortage by raising the price. Hence, in both cases, the price adjustment moves the market towards the equilibrium of supply and demand. Unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of this nowadays with people charging an arm and a leg for hand sanitizer, toilet paper, and, of course, masks. This brings us then to the law of supply and demand. And I'm sure most of you have heard about this. This is the claim that the price of any good adjusts to bring the supply and demand for that good into balance. The idea is, if you have so many buyers and sellers, that eventually things will reach that level of equilibrium. That is to say, in a market without any manipulation of any sort. Thus, surplus and shortages are temporary. That is, in a market without any manipulation of any sort. In fact, I think we're seeing that now with less people going out into the markets and hoarding and getting what they needed. The market seems to be adjusting, except outside the Trader Joe. That's always going to be crowded. Economists are very concerned with being able to analyze changes in equilibrium. Your textbook gives 3 steps which you can find on Table 3 on page 78 of your textbook. The first thing is, decide whether the event shifts the supply or demand curve, or perhaps both. Second, decide in which direction the curve shifts. And third, use the supply and demand diagram to see how the shift changes the equilibrium price and the quantity. In our analysis, let's take our good old friend, the ice cream cone. It's a really hot summer. Hot summer causes buyers to demand more ice cream. The demand curve shifts from D1 to D2, which causes the equilibrium price to rise from $2 to $2.50, and the equilibrium quantity to rise from 7 to 10 cones. An event that raises quantity demanded at any given price shifts the demand curve to the right. The equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity both rise. The 3 steps for analyzing changes in equilibrium. First, decide whether the event shifts the supply or demand curve, or perhaps both. In this case, it was the demand curve that was shifted by the hot weather. The more people wanted ice cream. Second, decide in which direction the curve shifts. There was more demand for ice cream, and so the demand curve shifted to the right, and there is a higher quantity sold. Third, use the supply and demand diagram to see how the shift changes the equilibrium price and quantity, and that was the red and the white lines. We can see here how a decrease in supply affects the equilibrium. An event that reduces the quantity supplied at any given price shifts the supply curve to the left. The equilibrium price rises and the equilibrium quantity falls. Here's an increase in the price of, let's say, sugar, an input. It causes sellers to supply less ice cream. The supply curve shifts from S1 to S2, which causes the equilibrium price of ice cream to rise from $2 to $2.50, and the equilibrium quantity to fall from 7 to 4 cones. Apply the 3 steps for analyzing changes in equilibrium. First, again, decide whether the event shifts the supply or demand curve, or perhaps both. In this case, it was the demand curve that was shifted by the hot weather and more people wanting ice cream. Secondly, decide in which direction the curve shifts. There was more demand for ice cream, and so the demand curve shifts to the right, as there is a higher quantity sold. Third, use the supply and demand diagram to see how the shift changes the equilibrium price and quantity. Finally, from figure 12 in your text on page 80, you can see how a shift in both supply and demand affect equilibrium. I think you're clever enough to do the analysis by yourself. Shall we play a game? Well, normally the handshake market, we'd be playing a game in class, but alas, we can't do that as of course we're stuck here in quarantine, so sad face and so forth.